In 1903, the French bark president Félix Faure left Puembu in New Caledonia with a cargo of nickel ore. The ship was involved in trade between Europe and New Caledonia in the Pacific Ocean. But shortly after departure, it encountered bad weather, which persisted for almost the entire voyage. By March 13th, the weather had turned extremely bad. First, the ship sailed through thick fog, and then a strong wind hit, pushing it off course until the bark struck a steep cliff about 780 feet high. After such a collision, the crew had to urgently launch the lifeboat and land on the shore. They had no other choice. The ship was shattered to pieces, and all the supplies and belongings were lost in the water. The survivors spent 60 days on unknown land before they were rescued. Throughout those 60 days, they were forced to survive by eating the birds that lived on the island. However, the shipwreck brought more than just people to the island. Along with them, mice arrived, and in fact, there was nothing surprising about that. Rats and mice in the mid-19th and 20th centuries were part of maritime life. The rodents inhabited nearly every ship at the time and would disembark on land whenever the ships docked. By the way, according to another theory, the mice accidentally arrived on this land in 1893 from a sunken ship or from one of the vessels of the numerous seal hunting gangs. But whatever the case, these harmless little rodents found their way to the Antipodes Islands, where they unexpectedly turned into not just a serious problem, they became mass killers. Their impact still remains today. And how it happened and what to do about it, we'll find out after a cup of coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something under the video. Let's start perhaps with the mice. In this case, we're talking about house mice, those tiny furry creatures that probably everyone has seen. House mice live on all continents, and although they often eat plant-based food, they're actually omnivores. They eagerly eat invertebrates, hunt birds, chicks, and eggs. There have been recorded cases where mice killed chicks of large seabirds, literally eating them alive in the nest. Everywhere mice go, they create competition for resources and predation, altering biodiversity, especially when it comes to a closed space. You know, like an island? For some birds, these tiny creatures represent an actual threat of the extinction of an entire species. This is especially true for seabirds, as in many parts of the world, they evolved without mice, and in general without predators targeting nests, so they have no protection whatsoever. It's known that mice bite off parts of their prey that are nearly 300 times larger than their own size. If a chick survives the attack, the open wounds, including scalping caused by the assault, often lead to death. Additionally, island mice often evolve and become 50% larger than regular house mice, allowing them to hunt larger prey. On islands, there are often birds with a long lifespan that don't reproduce until they're 10 years old. For such species, the loss of chicks can jeopardize the survival of the entire population. For example, a study published in 2018 showed that mice kill 2 million seabird chicks every year on Go Island alone. That's in the Atlantic Ocean. Go is one of the most important seabird colonies in the world, but mice have made their way here too. Cameras set near the albatross nest during the 2019 breeding season showed that mice form groups of up to 9 rodents to devour the chicks alive. But even more alarming is the fact that the mice also eat adult birds. This was also captured on film. In 2018, the bodies of 23 yellow-nosed albatrosses with injuries inflicted by mice were found there. Some of the birds, scientists suspect, died precisely because of these wounds. Since mice are opportunistic and breed quickly, changes in behavior spread through the population like wildfire. In other words, if one mouse thinks that eating chicks is a great idea, soon all others will start doing the same. In short, the situation is very serious, and this happens on any island where mice appear. The Antipodes Islands are no exception. They're considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site and are located about 470 miles from the southern tip of New Zealand's South Island, that is in the Pacific Ocean. The islands, which include the main Antipodes Island and 6 smaller ones, are uninhabited and completely inhospitable. Instead of humans and the comforts of civilization, here you can find unique plants and wild animals, including 21 species of nesting seabirds and more than 150 species of insects. By the way, 17% of these species are found only on the Antipodes. And here, in this paradise, mice arrived. They arrived and reproduced at an alarming rate. At one point, the mouse population reached 200,000 individuals. This huge crowd managed to wipe out at least 3 insect taxa from the Antipodes Island. It's unknown whether the mice attacked the birds. Researchers either didn't find or didn't look for signs of attacks. And while you're imagining how the mice might have bribed the scientists to keep quiet, I'll say the concerns about the birds on the Antipodes Islands still exist. These concerns are partly driven by what's happening on Go Island, which I've already mentioned. Mice have an enormous impact on a whole range of species, and the more unique these species are, the sadder the consequences. However, sometimes the influence of rodents allows us to uncover unknown historical facts. This story took place 2 decades ago when zoologist Carolyn King and one of her students were unraveling the origins of New Zealand's invasive mice through genetic analysis. The researchers found that house mice on the North Island descended from European mice that hitched rides on British colonist ships 2 centuries ago. No surprises there. But when King and her team analyzed the mice on the South Island, they discovered that the animals were related to mice from Southeast Asia. These mice are common in China, but had never been found outside of Asia. All of this suggested that the mice traveled from China to the South Island in the 1800s, when New Zealand was still part of the British colony called Australia. But there were no historical records about this, at least none in English. And so in 2022, they found an explanation. The rodents arrived with traders who sailed to China to illegally sell the skins of New Zealand fur seals and then returned to the South Island. These smugglers who avoided official routes had no idea that the mice's genes would give away their movements centuries later. But let's return to the present, where people are well aware of what an invasive species can do when it reaches a remote island. New Zealand decided to save the islands from mice. 10 rangers, 3 sniffer dogs, the government minister, and armed forces personnel were sent on a special mission to track down the mice. A budget of $680,000 was allocated, and it became one of the largest and most ambitious eradication programs ever attempted anywhere in the world. And remember when I said these islands are incredibly inhospitable? Well, I wasn't kidding. The work there turned out to be exceptionally difficult. The main issue was the island's isolation and rugged terrain. Even though the project kicked off in 2014, planning had actually begun much earlier. Before starting the eradication of the mice from 2014 to 2016, a preparatory program was carried out to support the team and protect the helicopters, repairing field huts, building a temporary hangar, clearing helicopter landing pads for refueling, and much more. All because the coastline of the islands is generally inaccessible. There are no harbors to dock, only cliffs. However, in the northern part, there's space for small boats, but landing there is only possible in calm weather. Even the project leader from the Department of Conservation emphasizes that the first challenge for the team was simply getting to the islands. Everything else came after that. As for the eradication, the main method chosen was bait dropping. In June 2016, 65 tons of grain-based rodent bait were dropped by 2 helicopters over a total island area of 5,000 acres. But simply spreading poison wasn't enough. On the ground, a team of 13 people supported the operation, spending 75 days eliminating around 200,000 mice. The problem was that there were a lot of mice, and every single one of them had to be eliminated. If even one mouse survived the operation, the population would eventually recover. Of course, it wouldn't happen overnight, and for a while there wouldn't be any visible signs of them. But by the time they became an obvious, noticeable problem again, their numbers would have been so high that the entire operation would have to start from scratch. Pretty much a standard situation with invasive species. I've explained how this works plenty of times before. It's all or nothing. Still, spreading poison and all the other efforts weren't the end of the story. Teams spent a whole month scouring the island searching for dead mice, or live ones, though they were definitely hoping not to find any. And after all that, they had to leave the islands as carefully as possible. Like I said, they're uninhabited, so it was crucial not to leave any traces of human presence. Even the helicopter landing site was soon overgrown, returning to its natural state. So how did it all end? On March 20th, 2018, the Minister of Conservation declared that, thanks to one of the world's most ambitious conservation projects, mice had been completely wiped out from Antipodes Island. It was one of the toughest pest eradication operations in history. People won. Now the island's flora and fauna can thrive as the mice are no longer hunting insects, competing with ground-dwelling birds, or eating chicks, even if they hadn't got around to that yet. It's worth noting that New Zealand's struggle with invasive species wasn't just about mice or limited to one island, but it's been consistently addressed. Since the 1990s, the country has systematically cleared its sub-Antarctic islands of invaders, wiping out rats, mice, rabbits, cats, goats, and stoats. In 2016, New Zealand set an ambitious goal to completely eliminate all invasive predators by 2050. But it's quite a long project with many stages. For example, by 2025, the New Zealand government aims to suppress or remove invasive predators from an additional 2.4 million acres of land and completely eradicate all introduced predators from the country's island nature reserves. And as sad as it may sound, since it involves the destruction of animals, the global extinction crisis is worsening on islands. They're extremely vulnerable to ecosystem degradation and species extinction due to invasive species, so eliminating these invaders is the only way to make a difference. And New Zealand is succeeding. For example, in 2001, Campbell Island was cleared of rats. Slightly earlier, in 1993, rabbits and mice were eradicated from Enderby and Rose Islands, and by 1992, a small population of goats had been removed from Auckland Island. In 2014, cats and rats were wiped out on Great Mercury Island in the Hauraki Gulf. And in 2009, 8 species of pest mammals, including rats, mice, cats, and stoats, were eradicated on Rangitoto and Matutapu Islands. In general, as you can see, invasive species are pretty much the same everywhere. As a result, more than 100 of New Zealand's 220 large islands are now pest-free. The next goal is to achieve the same result on the North and South Islands. And then I thought, how did mice end up all over the world? I mean, it's clear they arrived in New Zealand on ships, but did their spread really start only in the 19th century? I decided to look up some information, and I'm glad I did. It turns out that house mice began their long journey all the way back in India, where they lived alongside humans for thousands of years. Later, they spread to the eastern Mediterranean around 12,000 BC and only reached the rest of Europe by around 1000 BC. But that was just the beginning of the journey, because mice still had to leave Europe. I feel like I'm telling you some kind of plot from the Redwall universe. Hit the like button if you've watched or read it. You can leave a comment too. So it's believed that the first to carry house mice out of Europe were the Vikings. It was aboard their ships that the rodents reached Iceland, Greenland, and possibly even Newfoundland in the 10th century. After that, things slowed down a bit, and it was the Spanish conquistadors who brought house mice to the Caribbean in the 1500s. The mice quickly established populations and spread along the coasts of North and South America. It's believed that French fur traders and English colonists helped them here. They arrived in North America about 100 years later and brought even more mice. In the end, over the last 500 years, the house mouse has settled all over North America, Asia, and Australia, North and South America, and the coast of South America. But it wasn't just mice that spread across continents by ship, rats did too. And that was a whole different level of problem. Rats are bigger, more aggressive, and bolder than mice. What's more, they're smarter and have amazing resilience. Aboard ships, rats would destroy food supplies or directly attack the sailors, biting their toes off while they slept. Historians emphasize the widespread presence of ship rats in the 19th century, settling in sacks or barrels of grain, coffee, cotton, and other goods. Rats hitched rides on transport networks connecting rural areas to port cities, sneaking into the ship's hold and the cargo, or deliberately climbing mooring lines and gangplanks. Rats would find a paradise full of food and shelter, and they didn't particularly care where that paradise was heading. They usually left the ships along with the cargo and established new populations around the world, but some became permanent residents of the ships. To find sources of food and water on board, as well as to build nests, rats relied on their sharp incisors, which could break through almost any wooden structure of the ship or storage material. According to a court case at the Cape of Good Hope, during times of severe thirst, rats would even chew leaden pipes conveying water. Sometimes rats would even tear the sails to pieces, perhaps in search of nesting materials. And the most surprising thing was that neither cats nor dogs, which were brought aboard as rat catchers, helped. On the contrary, they became victims of the rats. Just imagine how tough these little creatures were. Still, people did try to fight back, of course not immediately. From the mid to late 19th century, when there was a significant rise in global shipping and mass migration of people and animals, rats were regarded as the norm. Yes, they were on ships, chewing on everything and biting people, but it was seen as just part of the sailor's job. Then, between the 1890s and the 1920s, the battle against rodents shifted to ensuring a clear boundary between land and sea. In other words, people began taking steps to stop rats from getting on board ships. During this time, with the third plague pandemic underway, rats quickly became linked to outbreaks of this disease. Naturally, no one wanted to see them on any ship anymore. A variety of technologies and strategies were used to stop the rodents, and international agreements were made to rid ships and docks of pests. For instance, one strategy involved releasing toxic gases on ships to disinfect goods and later to kill rats. Then, from the 1920s to the 1950s, people realized that creating special boundaries between land and sea was ineffective against rodents. That's when architectural and spatial strategies were developed to prevent not only chewing, eating, drinking, swimming, and climbing, but also nesting and movement aboard ships. For example, one method developed in Egypt involved submerging a ship underwater for half an hour to drown the rats on board. Ships were also fumigated with charcoal, sulfur, mercury, or boiling steam as a last resort. Special barriers were installed on the ropes, which later became known as rat guards. By the way, they're still being used today, with varying degrees of success. In 1900, Australian authorities in Sydney and Melbourne introduced mandatory use of rat protection devices, tarring of mooring lines, lifting and tarring of gangways at night, docking ships 4 feet away from docks and piers, and a number of other rat protection measures. And you know what? The rats couldn't care less about all these obstacles. They didn't stop them. So people had to come up with something else. One of the approaches was to think like a rat in order to fight them. The interior spaces of ships were redesigned to make them less comfortable for rats. This is the same room before and after anti-rat measures were implemented. On the left, you can see the rat's assumed path, and on the right, numerous obstacles have been added along the way. While the rats could probably still climb around the room, they were deprived of both hiding spots and routes connecting this room to the rest of the ship. Here's another example. Previously, a rat could sneak in through a vent, reach all the food, and then either continue exploring or escape the same way. A simple vent cover put an end to that. Of course, it took effort for people to see a ship through a rat's eyes. It required serious knowledge and imagination. But in the end, rat-proofing specialists developed one of the most successful rodent control measures ever attempted. This kind of rat prevention quickly became a more effective strategy than simply trying to poison them. In 1972, it was even reported that unlike poisons, which were only 70 to 80% effective, the new rat-proofing measures delivered lasting results. By the early 1930s, rat-proofed ships had spread worldwide, and so the rodents that had sailed with humans for centuries were finally driven off ships. Well, almost everywhere. And that's something to be happy about. The most important news lately is that I did an extensive blood test for my thyroid. And one of the numbers was 120 times higher than normal. Well, off I go to sort this out. Rats versus reefs. This might sound weird, but rats can actually harm corals and fish. How's that possible if they're land animals? Well, it's a pretty complex chain of events, and the latest study published in Nature explains it perfectly. We've already talked about how rodents harm birds all over the world, and the Great Barrier Reef is hit especially hard since the black ship rat's been a local pest for over 200 years. Their tactics are simple. They eat the eggs of nesting birds and hunt their chicks, reducing bird populations on the islands where they live. Classic story. So what do coral reefs and other sea creatures have to do with it? Well, it's all about bird poop. Researchers found that fish biomass was way higher around islands without rats. So you get it, right? The more birds, the more they poop. And turns out that's great for marine life. Here's a great example of how this works. In the Chagos Archipelago in the Indian Ocean, not far from the Maldives, the islands are split into those where introduced rats live and those where they don't. A group of scientists compared seabird numbers and soil nitrogen levels on rat-infested islands and those without them. They found that on islands without rats, seabird numbers were 760 times higher than on islands with rats. As a result, the rate of nitrogen deposition from bird droppings was 251 times higher. As for the islands where the rats lived, the decrease in nutrient levels affected the reefs and fish. In a perfect scenario, this is how it should work. Birds poop on the land, and then the rain washes it all into the sea. However, the rats wipe out the birds, and as a result, the sea doesn't get the nutrients it needs. And the outcome is obvious. Rats in Alaska. St. Paul Island's a tiny patch of land in the Bering Sea, boasting an incredible variety of wildlife, including rare seabirds and sea lions. It's even called the Galapagos of the North. But this perfect place can be ruined by rats, and experts' concerns are definitely justified. The last time a rat was found in Alaska, in 2018, it took locals almost a year to find and kill it. It all started with a call from a local to the Ecosystem Conservation Department, and around 400 people were put on the job. Yes, to find just one rat. People searched for droppings, food scraps, checked hidden spots with flashlights, set up peanut butter traps. Can you imagine how intense the battle was? Now officials fear another rodent might have appeared on St. Paul Island, which is why they've called on residents and the federal government for another hunt. Such an active search for even one rodent is linked to the government's efforts to protect the island's unique biodiversity. The head of the invasive species team says that a rat invasion could be more damaging than an oil spill, and it's hard to disagree. Rats are small, fast, and they love feeding on chicks. The disappearance of birds, in turn, could lead to even bigger problems as their contribution to the ecosystem decreases. Remember the droppings and nitrogen? Well, without enough seabirds, the island could lose its nutrients, which would cause problems for other wildlife. To prevent all of this, efforts to stop a rat invasion are carried out year-round on St. Paul Island. Baited traps are set up at every port, and the government is very keen on keeping invasive species off the island. The reasoning is simple. Stopping the rats from settling is far cheaper than handling a rodent invasion down the line, and the local wildlife will be grateful. And if you're wondering what rats are even doing in Alaska, the answer's pretty obvious. In the past, it was too cold for rats to survive in the area for most of the year, but climate warming has made Alaska more welcoming to these animals. The number of ships in Alaska's waters has also increased, and they can all serve as potential hiding spots for rodents. Unlikely port workers. Now let's look at rats from a positive angle. Of course, this doesn't apply to the pest species, but to the giant African pouched rats. Border officials spent several years figuring out how to stop the illegal wildlife trade, and that's where those very rats came in handy. Kate Webb, a researcher at Duke University, led their training and said they have an excellent sense of smell and can detect a wide range of odors. Her team successfully trained 8 out of 11 rats to sniff out pangolin scales, ivory, and even rhino horn. When choosing the animal species that the rats needed to be able to detect, the researchers followed certain guidelines. First and foremost, these were species that are typically targets of illegal trade around the world, particularly from East Africa. According to scientists, this is a great choice, even better than dogs. African giant pouched rats are inexpensive and can live up to 11 years, much longer than other rat species. Their small weight makes it possible to lift them to higher places for inspection, which allows, for example, access to ventilation systems in cargo containers when searching for wildlife. Researchers also stated that existing vehicle screening tools are time-consuming, while rats provide an affordable and efficient alternative. Overall, it's the perfect solution for Border Patrol agents. And also, these rats are pretty cute. You owe me a like. See you later.